your comments and questions during the session today. So we will have the interactive exchange at the end of the meeting, which is very important for us. So if I can get my slide up at the big banner here. Okay, I'll get this. We'll try. Maybe somebody can help here on getting this slide rolling.
I normally do like this, but it's a question of where.
Maybe it's this one.
Oh, we got a new.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That one looks like it's turned on. Oh, yeah, because that's on. Oh, maybe it has to be pointed at that.
Okay. And now it's back again.
Where does he have to point it at?
No, you can just give it.
Okay. I think it works. Thank you for your patience. We know you're busy. You need to be back at 3 o'clock again. So we will move fast over the agenda here. Now you are in the middle of very complex tariff negotiations, and you're very busy. You also have a very heated and very ambitious agenda in the afternoon, not in the afternoon, but in the autumn, with a number of rounds for the second half. And just want to say that industry fully supports these negotiations and wish for an early delivery at the end of the year. We know that you have a lot of work in front of you with all the planned meetings in the autumn. But we also think it's a very good sign that you have planned already this stage here, and that shows seriousness of this negotiation. And we wish negotiators the best of luck with this work for the second half of 2015. So focus for the dialogue meeting today will, however, be somehow different, as we want to give you some illustrations on other serious trade barriers beyond tariffs on goods. We will take the focus of the global supply and value chains, and we will have 2 industry partners with us today and 3 trade experts, which will in 15 minutes give their views and suggestions in the remainder of this trade agenda. Trade. We will also look into all the other barriers beyond the goods agenda, and you know them, so I need not dwell of them along. There are consequences from these non-tariff barriers seen from an industry and a supply chain perspective, and we'll try and give you some illustrations of this today. We will have a contribution from the OECD on local content requirements and why they are not a good instrument to use. And we also hope that with these contributions that you hear today, and also of course with a possible follow-up, that you as negotiators will secure indeed a living agreement, i.e. securing a continuation of negotiations beyond tariffs in coming years. Of course, it's not for us to set any kind of agenda for the years to come, but if you are indeed able to deliver a result on the EGA this year, which we very much hope, this kind of format of trade negotiations are highly interesting, seen from a civil society point of view and also from an end consumer's point of view, I can promise. So with these words of introduction, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Jody Roussel from Trina Solar. She is Head of Public Affairs for Europe and North Africa. She has previously worked in World Economic Forum and ACOR in Washington, D.C., and she will now give us some examples from the solar industry. Please.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. So I'm going to speak for hopefully just under 15 minutes to help you with your schedule getting back at 3 o'clock on barriers in the solar industry today from a value chain perspective. I'll start with just a couple slides on the status of the global solar industry, as our industry changes quite substantively from quarter to quarter, not to mention from year to year. You can see here that in 2014, the total installed capacity was nearly 40 gigawatts. And interestingly, in blue, you can see the market in Europe, which was substantially below 2013. In gray, the Asia-Pacific market, which is booming. In yellow, the Americas. In green, China, which is quickly becoming 50% of the global market. And then in light gray, the Middle East and Africa, which is a new market growing very quickly. The PV value chain is very globalized, but China and the Republic of China in Taiwan lead production and sales of traded cells and modules. This is interesting because this is where the core intellectual property in solar lies, is at the cell level. So I've just updated a slide that we've been using for years to introduce the value chain along all the steps which I know you've been looking at in your assembly of the appropriate goods to be included in your EGA discussions. If we look at where the cells are, in terms of who's developing and controlling the intellectual property in the solar industry, you can see that from 2006 until today, there's been quite a dramatic shift as manufacturers based in China, like my company, have invested very heavily both in R&D and in manufacturing capacity, to the point where today 76% of all cells made in the world are manufactured in China and another 11% manufactured in the Republic of China. A very small percentage is made in other countries today. And this is quite significant from a origin and a content perspective. The good news in solar is with this massive increase in manufacturing, solar prices are now competitive with more traditional sources of energy, gas, nuclear, coal. So you can see the good news here, these are the average prices. And the metric that's used by the power project developers, which is US dollars per megawatt hour. And the good news is that solar prices now are substantially less than they were a few years ago, making solar now a competitive technology of choice for new utility projects all around the world, from the United States to South Africa to even Abu Dhabi. This slide I've showed previously in January, but for anyone who's new here, I thought I would include it just to give you a sense of where does one of our solar modules that's being installed, for example, this week in the UK come from. It starts here with manufacturing equipment and polysilicon, and manufacturing equipment from the US, from Switzerland, from Germany, that is then sent to our main manufacturing campus in China, where we have R&D, product design, wafer cell, and module manufacturing. We also have manufacturing in other countries such as Malaysia and Thailand today. Then the product is assembled in China and shipped with a Dutch partner around the world to our shipping and distribution center for Europe, which is in Rotterdam. Then the product is sent to the UK, which is supported by local marketing, which is based out of Germany for Europe, and then installed. The recycling then will subsequently take place in 25 to 30 years, based on fees that we're paying on a quarterly basis in the UK today. So that's the journey of one of our modules, from manufacturing equipment and raw materials to construction to installation, and ultimately to the grave in the form of probably a glittering concrete sidewalk like at the WTO entrance, where you can see it sparkling with bits of recycled, looks like silicon. Now looking forward into your work and how this relates to the solar industry. We're very excited that you've made so much progress in your rounds. You've been very secretive. We understand that there's somewhere around 600 goods that are on the list. This sounds very positive, and we congratulate the great ambitions and all the work that's gone into this so far. We understand that you may be targeting agreement by the end of this year, which is great. In terms of planning for the future, I wanted to make a comment in terms of the addition mechanism. We don't know in industry what you're considering, but I wanted to offer a perspective from not only how we operate as a listed company on a quarterly basis, but also how we're expected to make filings to financial markets, how governments, for example, today expect us to make filings and payments for recycling fees in the solar industry. If a revision process will be pragmatic and efficient and operate in terms of the same type of timeline that industry is operating on, we want to recommend that you consider a quarterly process, where a product that's proposed in one quarter could then be accepted by an efficient mechanism. Perhaps that would take place through the IEC, perhaps another body, but that the mechanism to add new products could operate along a timeline that companies that are developing and manufacturing this technology would also be able to work with quite efficiently. There are more disturbing examples, for example, in the World Customs Organization, where one has to wait 5 years for new products to be appropriately acknowledged. We hope that a timeline for an addition mechanism under the EGA will not take so long. Because if it does, the EGA could become an unintended barrier to innovation if a new product may not be considered for years or months, or even worse, an uncertain amount of time. So I wanted to make that comment for your consideration as you're moving forward with this mechanism, considering how will products that are invented in the future be incorporated. And as an illustration, I have a picture of a really cool new technology, which is actually not from my company. It's from a small, innovative competitor. And if you happen to go to the World Expo in Milan, you can see it in the German pavilion. This is a printed organic solar cell, and it's set inside a plastic lamination, which is flexible and waterproof. And the efficiency is low, but architects all around the world, their imaginations have been captured by this technology in this building, which incorporates it. It's transparent, it's flexible, it's waterproof, and it has an uncertain future, but certainly it should be included in the scope of future agreements. And it may be already under the 6-digit HS code for electrical devices producing from the sun. But I want you to consider this as you move forward in your deliberations. How will new technologies be included, and how can we stop the EGA from being a barrier to innovation and for the trade of new and innovative devices? Another perspective on services. When we were speaking with the ICTSD about the hard to define, from our perspective as a company, area of services, we started talking about visas. And I wanted to share with you a mini case study of a situation my company has actually experienced in the past 3 years, which was around service barriers. Sometimes services from skilled workers are not easily available, and delays in visas mean significant delays in moving forward with a manufacturing or a project investment. So we want to recommend visa liberalization should you consider including services in the future. In this case, Country A wanted to bring its intellectual property and a group of senior skilled engineers from Country A to Country B, where it was considering an acquisition of an older facility that would be updated for local manufacturing. The challenge was that Country B didn't have any workers with these skills, and they didn't have any workers that already knew how our company in Country A was operating. So we needed to bring over our skilled workers, and there was a fairly large group of about 15 to 20. But it was uncertain in the beginning who had to be on the team. The project start was delayed by over 8 months because as the first 2 workers ultimately got visas, then there were new delays when every time they had to recognize a new team member with a different set of specialized skills would be invited. The challenge was that the project start was always delayed because there was always another person who was identified, and then they would have to wait another 1 to 2 months to obtain a short-term business visa in order to be able to go visit Country B to work on plans for the actual investment. So I wanted to give this as an example to make services liberalization a bit more tangible. The limits on visas for skilled workers, particularly for workers who are already employees of a company and the company wants to redeploy them, can be a very significant problem in our industry because there's a shortage of skilled workers who have 10 years or more of experience, as this is a young industry and it's rapidly growing. And these are not skills that you can easily obtain by hiring local talent, which simply may be in too short supply. If I shift gears to commenting on then other areas of trade barriers that are affecting our global value chain in solar, one of them is the dangers of anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, and how sometimes this brings unintended consequences. As some of you may know, there is a price undertaking currently regulating the imports of solar products from China, including the cells and the modules that I showed you some statistics on earlier, into Europe. And originally the market was expected to be 12 gigawatts, which is this full amount. And in the bubbles you can see the different pieces of the market that were expected to be serviced by different types of manufacturers. Because with a 56 euro cent minimum price that was set, effectively becoming a price ceiling, we saw a new market develop, one where EU manufacturers could fulfill a small amount of production with their own module capacity, one where other manufacturers from outside of China would also be able to sell, and one where effectively Chinese companies would be excluded despite the good intentions to create some market share for them. So in 2014, instead of 12 gigawatts, we had a market which was only 6.5 gigawatts, far away from the good intentions of the negotiators in having a settlement to an anti-dumping case. And unfortunately, no new manufacturing was supported by this tool. Instead, there was a large run of cell manufacturing plant closures, which is again where the core information technology is. So there were a number of predictions that were discussed in the press and by industry action groups at the time of this case, but as you consider barriers to trade, many of these barriers that were predicted before this case moved forward actually came true. Reduction in gross margins, half of the projects becoming economically unfeasible because of regulated prices. Grid parity in Europe and many countries has been delayed due to the pricing. And producers from third countries, such as the Republic of China, Korea, and Japan, gained significant market share at the expense of the exporting industry from China, which still does represent 80% of the world's production. So as I close, I would like to leave you with a thought on policy coherence, which ties together all of these elements, tariffs, services, anti-dumping, and other non-tariff barriers. That firstly, import tariffs are increasing costs, not only at the point of import, but along the entire value chain. And that's reality for us as a manufacturer. Whether we're importing a product into China or the US or South Africa, every time there's an import tariff, that tariff is carried on to our customer and carried on to the government if that government is providing a subsidy for installation of solar energy. Secondly, the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tools, we believe, are tools of the pre-digital era, before globalization and before global supply chains, and they're unsuitable for addressing the trade conflicts that we have today. And lastly, perhaps most important, we see the use of these tools as a form of policy incoherence, where the United Nations, we see the G7, many groups announcing very ambitious targets for the use of clean energy, for reduction in carbon emissions, and for limiting global temperature increases. And in your hands, you have a great opportunity to start the end of policy incoherence and create a new coherent policy where global organizations and policy mechanisms of national governments are working together to fight against climate change. So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions later when Peter organizes the Q&A.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you to Trina Solar. We now move on to the next speaker, which is Hannu Vuonanen from ABB Global Motors and Generators Division. He is Head of Public Affairs in this division of ABB. He has a very long trade record in the private, or track record in the private sector, and he is also an industry expert in energy efficiency technology. So please, Hannu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. And good afternoon. My name is really Hannu Vuonanen, and I'm working for ABB, a leading power and automation company.
Microphone's up.
Oh. Thank you. Is it now on?
Yes.
Great. So I'm working for ABB, a global power and automation company. I have about 140,000 colleagues around the world in about 100 countries. And together we did or we got about 42 billion US dollars revenues or order intake last year. And quite many of my colleagues are, by the way, in R&D. We invested about 1.5 billion US dollars into R&D activities. But about trade barriers. I'm going to talk and concentrate during the next about 10-15 minutes. Great, thank you. On very innovative part of trade policy, and that's really non-tariff trade barriers. While duties and taxes are very clear to calculate, very easy to calculate additional cost to products and services, non-tariff barriers are really often a joker in the pack. Their real and final costs are often quite unforeseeable. In this presentation, I'm viewing NTBs using wind power as an example. ABB is a system and component provider for wind power industry. And while you heard already how these barriers, like local content requirements and different standard-related country-specific regulations and mobility of personnel, and so on, how they look like from solar business point of view. So I'm looking really from wind power point of view of this case. And even though the selection and NTBs for wind power seems to be a little bit different for wind power as to solar power, so anyhow the end result is always the same. Ladies and gentlemen, they undermine your hard work to facilitate and enhance the global trade of environmental sound products and services. Using the experience what we have gained in wind power business as a product and system provider for wind power producers, I try to really signalize that NTBs, non-tariff barriers, are contradictional to WTO and environmental goods agreement targets. NTBs, I mean, they increase costs without any long-term benefits for stakeholders, but they make climate and renewable targets more expensive. They do not support WTO targets to create circumstances where the world resources are optimally used, taking into account sustainable development, and they do not take into account and they do not support why we are basically here to achieve global free trade for environmental goods. So in next few slides I give some examples. I'm referring to 3 stages in wind power value chain. First project development, and then component and system supply, and as a last case, services. In wind power sector, the main NTB related issue is local content requirements. They make it mandatory to demonstrate that a certain proportion of project value is coming from local sources. This idea is good. It is a good idea to support local industry, but in most cases, anyhow, they do not support long-term competitiveness of the economy. While forcing investors and end users to adapt local production, local content requirements do not give signals to develop a local technology, production productivity, and to build human resources. Thus, they do not facilitate the long-term competitiveness of the economy and companies. They do also
I mean local content requirements, they also incentivize to invest production facilities which are not viable in long term. They do not help harness full benefits of economy of scale and hindering in that way, hindering renewables to become competitive with conventional energy production. Local content requirements have a large variety of forms and they are widespread. Last year, SETI Alliance identified 13 countries where local content requirements are in use. In this slide are a few examples of them. But anyhow, basically requirements can be classified into 3 categories. First, cases where feed-in tariff, that is the price what energy producer gets from consumers. So cases where feed-in tariff is bound to the local content, or project financing is limited to companies complying with the local content requirements, or tenders are heavily biased towards local production. If you then jump to the next, product certification. In this I take as example electrical motors, which are responsible for about 40% of global electricity demand. Luckily, really luckily, electrical motors are classified into 4 efficiency classes, and this classification is based on international accepted standards. Basically all OECD countries and in several non-OECD countries are applying minimum efficiency requirements for electrical motors, and this is a very good situation. But the problem what we are facing is that efficiency certification is really different from country to country. So there are many ways to do that. Self-assessment is one way. Registration is required in some countries, and test requirements in national certified laboratories are applied in some countries, and then we have also a combination of these 3 methods. So it's quite interesting, by the way, that even though based in the same international accepted standard, mutual certification acceptance does not exist. This means that when we are producing an electrical motor and exporting it to country A, we have to make their quite expensive certification tests in that country. When we ship that same product to country B, so we have to make again these tests. And if we export the same product to country C, so maybe authorities are coming to our laboratory and certifying our laboratory, and then we have to pay something of this certification, and then we can start shipments to that country. So this is quite an expensive exercise, I have to say, and they are making quite a lot extra costs and limiting in this way small and medium size enterprises to come in the international trade. Wind power needs also service. And again, we are in a situation where requirements vary from country to country, from utility to utility, and even from site to site. So, making a service in wind power turbine is quite a requiring and difficult work. And you have to take into account your own safety, and you have to take into account your colleagues' safety, and of course you have to know the technology you are taking care of. And this is something we have to take into consideration always when we are sending servicemen to wind power sites. But even though the most experienced servicemen are going to a site, so they might need to apply a new certificate or participate training when they are coming into the site or country. So this requires again time, this training and these certification procedures. They are causing additional costs again and creates entry barriers and thus reduce competition again. So this is a little bit the same case as in product certification. Why not to have one certificate which is applied in all countries? Ladies and gentlemen, these EGA negotiations are an important step forward liberalizing trade in green goods, and we really wish you success and productive working days, even though they are very long, I know. The political impetus we have now should be capitalized to tackle also non-tariff barriers. As discussed, these NTB are contradictional to EGA and climate policy targets. They do not help creating sustainable jobs, and they reduce SME sector's opportunities for global trade. So what I really wish is that keep NTBs on EGA agenda and also on other trade policy agendas you are active on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to respond possible questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Hannu. Now we'll shift the focus. We will have now two industry perspectives on how non-tariff barriers impact the business. We will now turn on to three knowledge contribution or research contributions, and here I would like to introduce the next speaker, Ron Steenblik from the OECD. He is a senior trade policy analyst in the Trade and Agricultural Department of the OECD. Ron has been doing research on environmental trade issues for more than a quarter of a century and is known, I'm sure, to many in the room here. So, Ron, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Bit of a strange room, huh? It looks like if we go crazy, we at least have padded cell here to contain it. I don't know who's going to bring up my. Oh, I just push here. Next. Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that's not officially recognized as an environmental good, but a market that's really fast-growing, and that for electric vehicles and batteries. No surprise, like some of the other goods that we've been hearing about, they too face tariff barriers, probably much higher tariff barriers than most of the goods that are being discussed by the negotiators at the moment, as well as a number of localization policies, including local content requirements. But first, for anybody who's not familiar, and this is a somewhat squishy term, electric vehicles, where are they placed? So you could kind of consider them between as a subcategory of energy efficient goods, certainly energy efficient vehicles, or greener vehicles, but then there's the broader category of electric propulsion, including the batteries that go into them. That's a major component of any electrified propulsion. There are many types of electric vehicles. The International Energy Agency distinguishes conventional hybrid electric vehicles from other vehicles and doesn't include that in its definition of electric vehicle. And I'm going to be mainly talking about what the IEA means by an electric vehicle, and those are ones that are whose propulsion is primarily provided by electricity. So that would include plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and pure electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, they're sometimes called. There's a new one starting to hit the market also, and those are fuel cell powered vehicles. They also, they're run off of a motor. They have no internal combustion engine, but instead of storing their energy in a battery, their energy is stored in the form of some kind of liquid carrier, such as hydrogen. But to put things into perspective, this chart shows global production of automobiles. We're actually updating this study, so I apologize, it only goes through 2013. But you can see it's in the range of about 90 million units a year. This category includes light trucks, SUVs, and so forth by automobiles. It's fairly well divided, production is fairly well divided between Northeast Asia, North America, the EU, the rest of the world, and China. Now this is a graph of sales of battery electric vehicles and plug-in hydro electric vehicles in 2013. You can see that the United States was the biggest market, followed by Japan and the Netherlands. In both the United States and Japan, pure battery electric vehicles and PHEVs had roughly equal shares of the market. In the Netherlands, it was mainly plug-in electric, and then in most of the rest of the world, it was battery electric. We're generating a new graph for 2014, and in that one, Norway would come in fourth. It would move up several places. It's an amazingly large market considering its size. But still, if we look at this, the total is less than a million, or was less than a million vehicles in 2013. So that's quite a small percentage of overall sales of vehicles. But here's one market researcher's prognosis for sales through 2020, and they're envisaging the BEVs and PHEVs accounting for maybe 3 million units by the turn of this decade. So that's a substantial growth, but a continuing growth also of hybrid electric vehicles. And unfortunately, from an environmental standpoint, one of the big areas for big markets for HEVs now are the larger vehicles, SUVs and so forth. There are a lot of hybrid electric vehicle SUVs and being sold in the United States now, for example. So why are policymakers interested in electric vehicles? For one, especially if you're interested or concerned about pollution in cities, they have no tailpipe emissions. And whereas, of course, an internal combustion engine has tailpipe emissions, ranging from very nasty particulates in the case of diesel vehicles to NOx and volatile hydrocarbons and so forth. If you're generating electricity elsewhere, or if your electricity is mainly generated by clean sources, then you've definitely improve the air of the city if your fleet converts to electric vehicles. Some people make a big point that you're substituting being dependent on oil companies, oil producers. Often, basically, the subtext is foreign oil producers, as opposed to your local friendly utility company. The main problems at the moment is that most battery electric vehicles take longer to charge than it takes to, for example, just put a hose in your vehicle and fill it up with liquid petroleum. Also, the range of the vehicles is usually less than their equivalent internal combustion engine one, but that's being improved all the time. The big thing, though, and often is a bit surprising for people, is how cheap they are to operate. Unless you're really, really paying a lot for electricity, they're generally cheap, or your fossil fuel is subsidized, they're generally a lot cheaper to run than per kilometer than an internal combustion engine powered vehicle. The other thing also is particularly battery electric vehicles have many fewer parts, and that means several things in terms of industrial development. One is the barriers to entry are lower, so we may see more competition as the cost of electric vehicles comes down. And it just also, the number of things that can go wrong, in theory, may be less. Now, mentioned before the environmental benefits. They, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants from combustion, of course that depends on the source of your electricity. This graph shows different, does this have a thing here? Yeah. So this is kind of a standard assumption of the life cycle emissions created, associated with the actual construction of the vehicle, and then the rest is from the electricity from operating it. And clearly, I mean, if your standard is somewhere around 100 to 125, if you're a country that's getting most of its electricity from nuclear power or renewable energy or solar, hydroelectric, whatever energy, then the overall emissions are going to be less. So, you know, we have a lot of countries here that are where the life cycle emissions are actually more using an electric vehicle, but the general feeling is that it's still not a bad idea to encourage their adoption because the world's moving towards cleaner energy, right, for electricity generation. Well, that's what we're all saying, and also, of course, the local pollution benefits. So, but you know, we just need to bear that in mind, that the actual emissions depend on the source of electricity. So, before I talk about incentives that countries are providing, let me talk a moment about disincentives. And probably one of the most important one are the prices of petroleum fuels and which make the operation or you know, the life cycle cost for a consumer relatively cheaper for an internal combustion engine than for an electric vehicle. And this is 2012. There have been a lot of changes. I mean, the world price has dropped and some of the subsidies have been eliminated, but I had to find a graph quickly that wasn't too cluttered with it. So, I mean, you can see they vary considerably, converted to U.S. cents per liter, from next to nothing in Venezuela to over $2.30 in the Netherlands. Quite a range here, and it's one additional reason for advocating reform of fossil fuel subsidies. The other problem are import tariffs. Now, at the moment, there's no separate harmonized system code for electric vehicles. They come under one that's for other motor vehicles. But several countries have created an X-out, so an 8-digit or 10-digit code for electric vehicles. But what was interesting in looking at the tariffs was that very few of them actually, at the moment, apply any lower tariff to this other category than they do to other vehicles. The exceptions are underlined are Russia and Mexico. So for the countries that are participating in the EGA negotiations, I'd say probably the majority of them apply a a tariff that's less than 10% on electric vehicles. Once you get outside of that area, a number of them apply tariffs of 15 to 25%. 25% is not all that uncommon, and some even up to 100%. That's very, very high tariff. Now, making a distinction here between import tariffs and actual taxes on vehicles. Some countries apply very high taxes on vehicles, vehicle purchases. Some also like 100% excise tax. But at least they're not discriminating between foreign and domestic made. So let's talk about the incentives. There are a large number of incentives out there on the demand side. We call them demand pull policies sometimes, and they include public procurement preferences. Government agencies or the military even being encouraged to purchase clean vehicles. Then there are a number of either grants or tax benefits for buying them offered to consumers. And then in terms of the operation, wrong button here. There are a number of ways that the governments reduce the cost of operation through privileged access in highway lanes, or free parking, or reduction in annual tax, et cetera, et cetera. There's also government support for the development of battery charging infrastructure, or even for home chargers. So all of these are helping to reduce the cost to consumers. And these matter. I mean, you can see the effect of these on the uptake or share of electric vehicles in total purchases. And again, this is actually a fairly old one, but it shows that, again, the explanation of Norway with its very high incentives and its relatively high uptake. So, but like all of them, there are also many countries have localization policies. I won't talk about these in detail because I'm running out of time. But anyway, we've heard about some of these. For other industries, they're if anything, they're more prevalent for automobiles than they are for some solar power or wind energy. In terms of government preferences, these vary considerably, and I was able to get good data on the United States, and whereas you see very, very strong preference in government purchases for fleets for the U.S. companies, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, you don't for electric vehicles, or at least so far, electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles. The market is about divided half and half between foreign and domestic. Here's a number of examples of localization policies. I think these are going up on the web, so I'll let you read them on their own, but we've seen them particularly in Asia. So finally, just conclude with the effects. My colleagues are probably going to be saying the same thing. So again, that demand-side measures are actually facilitating trade by creating a market, drawing in imports. Norway is the best case of that, which doesn't have its own domestic industry. But of course, if they're combined with either high import tariffs or local content requirements, then effectively the demand-side policies become just a different way of providing production support. And when you have these kinds of policies, they increase. They reduce imports, and if it's on the production side, increase exports. So and then you have the usual problems of local content requirements of increased domestic costs, reduced choice, reduced trade, et cetera, et cetera. So I've run out of time, but I think you get the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And let's move on to another colleague from the OECD, Geraldine Ang. She's a policy analyst on green investments in the OECD. Prior to the OECD, she worked for the Earth Institute on economics of climate change. And today she will talk about the just released report from the OECD on local content requirements in solar and wind industry. So Geraldine, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for the invitation. Is it on? Yeah. I'm not going to repeat what you've heard already, and I think there's kind of a consensus at the table. But maybe I'll bring the investment perspective and how it relates to trade policy for you here within the WTO EGA negotiations. Jody called earlier for policy coherence with climate change goals, and I couldn't agree more that when you consider a global value chains for such environmental goods, you really recognize the need to align policies and address policy misalignments across trade and investment policies. And for example, when you look at different segments of the value chains, typically the trade policy will look at the midstream segment. But we should not forget that in parallel to the WTO negotiations, the UNFCCC is trying to achieve by December a goal of increasing finance and investment for climate change. And most of those climate investment, as you know, will take place in the downstream infrastructure sectors. And that's where the call for policy alignment is critical. So you all know the scale of solar PV and wind energy in trade. Let me just remind you that the share of solar and wind is also equally important in terms of investment in clean energy. And as Warren just highlighted on the role of green sectors to drive benefits such as climate change, solar PV and wind energy also are very critical to contribute to climate change mitigations. The IEA estimates that around $53 trillion are needed by 2035 in the energy sector to achieve the 2-degree target. But as you all know, there are also very strong co-benefits in developing and deploying trade and investment in clean energy, and especially in solar and wind, whether you're looking at improved access to electricity in rural areas, issues of reduced local air pollution and associated costs in cities, and issues of energy security. So I won't go into that detail, but colleagues have highlighted already that the solar PV and the wind energy value chains are spread across global production networks. So I won't go into that detail, but the implication in terms of investment and in terms of policy implications is obviously that in the context of global value chains, the increased share of intermediate inputs and the interconnection in trade exports and imports means that policies that affect the midstream segments are very likely to affect domestically in the one country that implement that policy, downstream activities such as installation, project development, infrastructure assets, and the installation and maintenance of those assets. The second key point, and it was stressed earlier by some of the speakers, is that unlike some perception, the value addition potential and local job creation potential of the solar PV and wind energy value chains, and especially in solar PV, lies mostly and primarily in the downstream activities of installation and project development. Just to give you some guesstimate across several studies, there's an estimate that manufacturing activities only represent 18 to 24% of jobs, while downstream activities represent more than 54%. The numbers varies, but the range are always similar. So it's an important thing to bear in mind that when you implement a policy to create local jobs, you need to take into account the entire domestic value chain in terms of your domestic jobs. So that's just a summary of what I was saying. It's really a gross estimate, but so we just launched that report that Peter just mentioned. I won't go into the detail of which sources we used, but just to say that we cooperated with SETI Alliance, which implemented a survey on restrictions, and they found very similar results than what we did when we conducted an investor survey towards leading international investors in solar PV and wind energy on what they consider to be key restrictions to international investment. And we also really build on the work that Warren Steinblick has been doing over the recent years, as well on local content requirements. And in addition, we implemented a new empirical analysis to assess the actual impact of local content requirements on international investment flows using a new modeling analysis. So the report, I put some copies at the entrance and some summary sheets that you can all access. I'd be very happy to share with you the PDF of the report. But basically, we've tracked and monitored a broad range of measures, because initially the question was, what are the key barriers to international investment in solar and wind energy? And we did not have any prejudice. And we looked at around 10 different measures, you know, whether we look at tariff and non-tariff barriers, standards, trade remedies, local content requirements, administrative barriers, access to the grid, etc., etc. And it's true that the issue of local content requirement has really been increasingly prominent in solar PV and wind energy. And just to give you one key number, we've tracked the use of local content requirements between 2000 and today, and there were sets in around 21 countries, including 16 OECD and emerging economies, but for the most part it was since the 2008 financial crisis. So the perspective here is that on renewable energy investment policy and trade policies, there's really been a shift towards green industrial policies since the financial crisis, given the perceived potential of solar and wind to create local jobs in the manufacturing sector. I won't go into other measures that are also very briefly monitored in the report and discussed, because we've really focused on local content requirements. But in terms of some of the impacts that we've assessed, both empirically and through case studies and experience and results from some trade models as well, obviously there was a clear detrimental impact on global international investment. And how did we do the analysis, just in case you're wondering? We looked at a model that included all feed-in tariff policies across Bloomberg New Energy Finance clean energy flows, which is pretty representative of a global, that's the main value for measuring the investment in renewable energy. And then we included all local content policies associated to feed-in tariffs. So we had to exclude for now public tenders, but that's already quite representative, and the impact was clearly negative. We also considered existing studies that looked at the trade impact of local content requirements, and as well as experiences from recent policies across OECD and emerging economies on the local job creation potential that I mentioned. And because downstream activities are so prominent in terms of value creation, well, it's not surprising that there's been some mixed or negative impacts in terms of local job creation and value addition. Technology transfer is another critical point that we haven't considered enough, but would deserve more attention. Obviously, the key negative impact is that it raised the cost of inputs for downstream activities, but people have already talked about it. The key message that I want really to stress is twofold. The first one is, like Jody mentioned, there is really a need for policy alignment. And as the trade and investment policies are increasingly interconnected in the context of global value chains, they can no longer be considered separately, because if you want, investment is the key word for achieving climate change goals. You need to scale up investment in green infrastructure to achieve the 2-degree target. And those trade and investment misalignments, Ron mentioned fossil fuel subsidies, while local content requirements are another example of misalignment that reduce the effectiveness of policy goals at the domestic level. The second key point, obviously, is that international cooperation is needed to align those policies, including non-tariff barriers. And the third point is that those policies were set up to create jobs, while evidence-based analysis is needed to demonstrate the actual effectiveness of policies and to reduce the cost of renewable energy policies, because we all know that in the current context of budget constraints, cost effectiveness and affordability of incentives is critical, and that there are other alternatives to support jobs and manufacturing activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. And let's now move on to the last, if I can call it, knowledge contribution from Mahesh Sukatan from ICTSD. He is a senior research fellow within that institution and is also a renowned trade expert in all trade experts of climate change and sustainable energy. He is also working as a private consultant for the World Bank, the International Trade Center, UNEP, ACP Secretariat, and many more. Today, he will give us some insights into the need to address mutual recognition agreements. Some of the speakers here have already touched upon for green technologies. Mahesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and it's good to be here. What I'll do today is we've already heard the earlier speakers give you good examples from a private sector perspective as well as on specific issues like local content requirements. So what I'm going to do today is to speak about one type of non-tariff measure, which are conformity assessment requirements, and then to bring that back into the EGA. What are the possible options for delegates in the EGA? And again, as Peter mentioned, these are just considerations and should not be taken as recommendations in any sense. So basically, everybody realizes that non-tariff measures are increasingly more important than trade. The EGA's present focus is on tariff elimination for a final list of products by December 2015. Now, what comes after that? Would non-tariff measures also be addressed? Perhaps in another phase. I mean, things are not clear at the moment. I mean, everybody is focusing right now on tariffs. But this is sort of looking ahead what comes after tariffs. So how do you start on non-tariff measures? I mean, obviously, there are a wide range of NTMs out there. So what could be some considerations that perhaps delegates could keep in mind when looking at prioritization of some of these measures? One possibility could be to look at what could be addressed in a relatively easy manner and sort of a low-hanging fruit among non-tariff measures. Another could be what are the non-tariff measures that really introduce a lot of cost and time on environmental goods trade and on the related components, and which NTMs have not adequately been addressed in other trade agreements, including RTAs, FTAs, and bilateral agreements, or they have been addressed, but they don't include all the EGA members. So this is something that could all bring together all the EGA members and bring benefits to everybody. So one candidate that I would propose is conformity assessment measures. And obviously, I mean, the ideas here are not based on any sort of data or factual collection from the bottom up. And this is again where I would also welcome private sector input into how important are some of these conformity assessment measures specifically for environmental goods. So conformity assessment, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it. So I won't go into the definition. It's basically, certification, testing, and inspection are sort of the three pillars of conformity assessment. And they are essential to meet health and safety standards. But at the same time, they also have the potential to become a trade barrier if they're designed or applied in a manner which are burdensome for exporters. And these, for example, include Hanu mentioned earlier about multiple test requirements for motors, requirements to test abroad, diversity of these requirements, I mean more than a lot of requirements required, and also lengthy approval times in the importing country. Now, there are three broad types of conformity assessments. There is first-party conformity assessment, which are essentially supplier's declaration of conformity, where the supplier himself would provide a declaration which is then accepted in the importing market. Now, this is probably the simplest method and the most preferred method for trade, and it reduces a lot of time and cost. But unfortunately, the level of confidence is not enough for many importers and for a lot of products to just rely on first-party assessment. So many importers also require second-party assessment, where the importer or the buyer would do their own sort of certification check with the purchaser. And this is, for example, widely employed in aircraft manufacture, where the buyer of the aircraft would actually do their own conformity assessment check on the parts to ensure that it conforms to the specification. What is most relevant from a trade perspective is actually third-party conformity assessment, where a regulatory body or an independent testing body would be the organization that actually undertakes the testing, and they would also be required by regulatory authorities as a prerequisite for importing that product. And this is employed in a wide variety of sectors like pharmaceuticals and so on. And I think a lot of traded goods where that additional layer of trust and confidence is required. Now, in terms of data, we don't have a lot of data out there, but one of the studies which the International Trade Center has done, for instance, and they did this in 11 developing countries, and 11 developing and least developing countries, which are Burkina Faso, Egypt, Jamaica, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritius, Morocco, Paraguay, Peru, Rwanda, and Uruguay. So what they found was that conformity assessment procedures accounted for about 31% of measures regarded as burdensome by businesses based on a simple average or arithmetic mean, and 24% when a trade-weighted average is used. And both in TBT as well as SPS measures, product certification was cited as the most burdensome requirement by about 37% of the firms that were surveyed, and product testing about 9% of firms, and inspection requirements at 8% of firms. So these three subtypes reportedly account for more than half of all firm complaints about TBT SPS measures. Now, these have been done for a few selected countries, and if you notice, I mean, not all of these are not the countries that would be very active in environmental goods export. So this is sort of just a proxy for goods in general. So obviously what is needed is more data on what specific environmental goods actually run into these kind of problems. But there have been a lot of surveys done. I mean, the OECD, for instance, has done some studies on specific sectors. And some of the findings are that conformity assessment costs are not readily quantifiable. This is because there are measurement difficulties associated with certain aspects such as opportunity costs of lost sales. But the surveys have also found that conformity assessment is less of a barrier in more developed countries where infrastructure is good, and there's also a better degree of market surveillance and product liability measures. So where product liability is weak and where greater market surveillance is required, products from those countries would face more of that additional requirement for conformity assessment. So the other thing that the OECD survey also found was that despite the preference or the preference for supplier's declaration of conformity, which is the ideal method, there was a rather slow acceptance of these SDOCs, and there was a persistence of multiple testing requirements. Further, the other interesting thing is that harmonization of standards is no guarantee for the ready acceptance of conformity assessment, because even if the standards are harmonized among products between different countries, there would always be a separate requirement for conformity assessment, and this would then require technical infrastructure in many of the exporting countries as well. Further, a lot of times conformity assessment requirements are used to compensate for lack of strict product liability laws, as I mentioned. And increasingly, there was an increasing complexity of conformity assessment requirements. For example, in energy efficient products, one of the things that the OECD has found is that there's a lot of non-aligned specification and tests for a number of energy efficient products. So these are probably some examples from the environmental goods area, and I think more examples and factual studies would be required here. So basically, one way of dealing with the diversity of conformity assessment requirements has been mutual recognition arrangements. Now, these basically are at different levels. So one could be just simple information exchange. Second could be mutual recognition of accreditation systems and testing procedures. Mutual recognition of conformity assessment test results. And then finally, we come to mutual recognition of actual technical regulations and equivalence of standards. Now, I would argue that, of course, that mutual recognition of standards may not, I mean, the WTO or the trade setting may not be the right forum for harmonization. So conformity assessment then becomes much more of a candidate for trade negotiators to work on, rather than the standards which would then have to be set in these other forums and then sort of reflected in the trade provisions. So the WTO TBT agreement encourages all members to reach agreement on mutual recognition of results of each other's conformity assessment procedures. Article 6.3 provides a mandate on that. And there have been a number of cases of examples of mutual recognition agreements on conformity assessment in the bilateral forum. There have been a lot of bilateral agreements, for example, between EU and the US, Canada and the EU, EU-Switzerland, to name a few. And all of these agreements are limited in sectoral scope. So they would look, for example, the EU-US agreement looks at sectors like telecom equipment, electromagnetic compatibility, pharmaceutical goods, etc. So they are limited in sectoral scope. So a lot of these sectors would probably have some overlap with environmental goods already. Not all of them, but some of them, like say electrical goods, for instance. Now, there have also been regional initiatives on mutual recognition and conformity assessment. So one example of is the APEC mutual recognition arrangement for conformity assessment of telecommunication equipments. There's also ongoing work in the APEC subcommittee on standards and conformance, and they've set up the solar technology standards and conformance initiative, the green buildings and green growth initiative. The interesting thing with APEC is that a lot of the APEC initiatives are voluntary, so there's no sort of a binding requirement there. But at the same time, members' economies agree that it's in the interest of everybody to have this kind of cooperation on some of these conformity assessment measures. There have also been private sector initiatives, and I think there was also a presentation by the International Accreditation Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, ELAC, as well as the International Accreditation Forum at the WTO. So these are private sector initiatives which are essentially MRAs between conformity assessment bodies. And the whole objective here is to facilitate trade among members, but rather than being government to government, or rather than being opposed or in opposition to the government, they sort of aim to build on the existing government initiatives as well. So the ELAC, for example, has about 80 accreditation bodies from 74 economies, and the scope extends to testing and calibration, and inspection. And the membership is also open, not the MRA, but a general membership is also open to regional cooperation bodies, laboratories, etc., and also consumer associations and organizations like that. Similarly, with the International Accreditation Forum, it oversees accreditation in the fields of management systems, personnel, and products. So what we see here is that they've established 3 mutual multilateral recognition agreements, what they call MLAs rather than MRAs. And this has been established for quality management systems, environmental management systems, and product certification. And so this is, again, a good example of a private sector kind of an initiative on mutual recognition. So this just shows the route to which companies could apply to become members of the ELAF or the IAF. So there are different steps that they would have to go through, and to be a member in these initiatives. So since it's on the website, I would leave that to you to read. So now coming really to the main gist, what could be a possibility for the EGA or for EGA members as part of maybe a second phase? So what I propose in my paper, which is still in a draft stage, is why not think about a plurilateral MRA on conformity assessment among the EGA members that would cover all the goods or the final goods that are agreed for tariff cutting. So whatever would come out at the end of the negotiations in December, there could also be a subsequent follow-up in terms of which of these products face conformity assessment difficulties, and perhaps having a sort of a plurilateral MRA to look at those issues. And it could draw, for example, on elements of existing government-to-government MRAs, like specifying product coverage, including remedies in case of market access obstacles, listing what are the relevant conformity assessment bodies in the countries, having information and exchange and sectoral contact points, among others. And the other option, of course, is looking at provisions which exist agreements with third countries. So what if some of the EGA members already are party to bilateral MRAs? What would be the impact of a plurilateral MRA, for instance, on those agreements? Further, the other question could also be extension of those MRA membership to non-EGA members. So if some countries are not party to the EGA, would the MRA be open to those countries as well? Or perhaps could that be also an incentive for some of the other countries to join this sort of a plurilateral an initiative? So what I would propose is that this MRA should not be in conflict with any existing agreements on conformity assessment, but it should build on or reinforce both existing government as well as private sector MRAs. So finally, in conclusion, one template that I would highlight would be the Singapore EU FTA. So this is very interesting because the Singapore-EU FTA includes a lot of provisions which provide for facilitating conformity assessment. So I won't go into the articles, which are, I'll list in the presentation and it should be up on the website. But for example, there are provisions which says that the conformity assessment measures should not be unnecessarily burdensome. There should be freedom of choice among the countries to select among the conformity assessment bodies, equitable charging of fees, as well as the Singapore-EU FTA also provides a possibility of very specific sectoral initiatives as well. And in addition, the Singapore-EU FTA also includes a separate chapter, Chapter 7, which deals with non-tariff barriers to trade and investment in renewable energy generation. And under this, Article 7.5 deals specifically with standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment. So paragraph 3, for example, actually picks out examples of products to which these measures would apply. So it says that with respect to products listed in Chapter 84 of the Harmonized System, as well as in HS 850231 and 854410. So these are solar panels and wind turbines, which are clearly in the Singapore-EU FTA. The Union will accept declarations of conformity from Singapore suppliers under the same terms as from EU suppliers for the purpose of placing such products on the market. Further, Singapore will accept EU declarations of conformity or test reports for the purpose of placing such products on the market without any further requirements. Singapore may require mandatory third-party testing under the conditions set out in Article 5 or safeguard measures. So, these are some provisions which already exist as an example of a bilateral FTA. So my contention would be, why not sort of look at those lessons and look at those provisions and see if some of them could actually be replicated in a plurilateral setting, and especially applying to those goods in an environment which are finally agreed in the EGA. So with that, I'd like to end and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahesh, and thank you very much to all 5 speakers here. We realize this is very much information in a very, very short time at a situation where you as negotiators are fulfilled, if I can put it that way, with complex negotiations on how to compile the tariff lists. But however, let's now turn to any comments or any questions among the audience here that you would like to raise to the speakers today. So please, who would like to go first? There's one question down here. I think it's the EU. Please.
Yes, my name is Sándor Szerkovszky. I'm from the EU mission. And thanks for the excellent panels. They are really thought-provoking. I would like to react to the presentation by Madame Russell on specifically on recent EU anti-dumping measures on solar panels. And we had our little exchange in January already, but since you are persisting in your views, I'm also compelled to react. So let me register again that some of the products entering the EU market were below. They entered the EU market at prices which did not even cover the cost of production. Now, this cannot be simply explained by market mechanism or comparative advantages or competitive advantages, even in the age of global value chains. It can only be explained by massive subsidization by the government concerned. And if you use such an anti-dumping arguments, I think it would be more convincing if you would also emphasize the need for enhanced anti-subsidy disciplines in this area. Thank you.
You want to answer?
Regarding, so I'm happy, of course, to respond to other questions, Sándor, as I know we have an exchange every time I come to visit here in Geneva. Regarding products that were sold below the cost of production, I can't speak for hundreds of companies across China, as it's 80% of the global market in production. I can only say from the perspective of my company where we stand, where the only subsidies that we've received from government were fully legitimate ones for our R&D facility, but we were caught up in a much larger investigation. and as the largest global manufacturer, of course, have been in a difficult position to be lumped together with hundreds of small companies for whom we have no visibility or responsibility for their business practices. In terms of products sold below the cost, we know today, for example, that European companies that launched this trade case are selling below the minimum import price that they cried was too low. So it's a complex environment that we operate in, and there are lots of rules. Some companies follow them, some companies break them, some companies choose, they pick and choose. But we know for sure that these trade barriers have contributed to a reduction of the market in Europe and also contributed to higher prices, which is in the end in no one's interest when we want to install more clean energy technology to fight climate change.
Thank you. Now looking to the next question or comment, and I see one down here, please.
Thank you. My name is Felipe Sandoval from Chile. We're not a negotiating party of the EGA, but we are a negotiating party to the TISA. And the first speaker, Mrs. Russell, made reference to a number of issues that may be related not only to goods, but also to services. And my question is, are you going to wait until the EGA pack goes into the services and the beyond the border number of issues, or are you going to take the shortcut and go into TISA? Are you lobbying TISA? Have you any? I mean, is there anything from you guys to say on that? Thank you.
So from the perspective of our company, I didn't include a slide about us because I was trying to be very brief and efficient with my slides. We only have 18,000 employees in 22 countries, so and we only sell 2.5 billion a year of products. So compared to ABB, we're like an ant standing next to an elephant in terms of scale. Solar energy is still a small business, even if we're the biggest company. I'm the only person who works in government affairs in all of Europe and Africa. There's one person who covers the Americas, so we're too small to engage further. That's the unfortunate reality, even if we're the biggest solar company. If there are specific recommendations that any of you have in terms of engaging with TSAP, if you think there's an opportunity and a good point to intervene, we can certainly consider it. But as a company, we're simply very small, and what SETI does in terms of creating opportunities is great, but the reality is that in biomass and solar and wind, there are lots of little companies, and we don't have the capacity to engage in all of the negotiations that we wish we could have a voice in.
If I also may follow up on the question regarding services, I believe it's fair to say that this is also something that could be interpreted from the Davos mandate back last year in January. I believe the negotiation was set out to a tariff on industrial goods elimination, but was also mentioning services and NTBs. So I guess in terms of the mandate, I think there's an industry expectation that these other areas will be addressed down the road. Whether, and if I understand your question correctly, TISA would be a faster route to this. Well, this is a possibility, but no guarantee, and something that, of course, we will also leave to negotiators to see what would be the more clever route here. I think the opportunity now is that the plurilateral approach on industrial goods is set for a result possibly this year. If you're able to deliver this, it's very interesting, and it would be a great inspiration maybe to continue to other areas, broader areas, as we have discussed here today. How that impact and interfere into more global negotiations, it's difficult to say. It's an open question. I think industry will be pragmatic and would like to have the fastest solutions to address these matters. I don't know whether there are others in the panel who want to address this issue here. Otherwise, I would just look for the next comment or question. Ron?
Hi, thank you. It seems like most of the questions are being addressed to Jody, but on this question of updating the list, which sometimes is spoken in terms of having a living list, I think we need to make two distinctions. There are products that may become available that would be covered by the whatever tariff lines are covered by the agreement. And so, I mean, as if there's anybody here from the WCO would agree, I'm pretty sure it covers all products. So it's not as if you have to wait 5 years before a product is covered. They would be included somewhere. The question is, would it be included under one for which the tariffs have been reduced as a result of the agreement? So if you have a solar cell that's using a new technology, and solar cells are covered by the agreement, I would think that it would be pretty sure they'd be covered. Now, you might have some disputes over classification, and I believe there's a arbitration procedure at the WCO, which I haven't experienced myself involved with that, but I assume that takes a lot less than 5 years to. I mean, for example, there was previously some disputes over how to classify biodiesel back in the about a decade ago, and that was finally resolved. But the bigger question is if there are some new goods that come along, and the producer of those goods or the inventor of that good says, "Ooh, I want this to be considered as an environmental good and added to the list, and that I can benefit, or those who produce my product can benefit at a zero tariff." Well, if it's not a line there, then I think that's an interesting question of how difficult or easy that's going to be. And I mean, you can imagine that if you have an agreement like this that is not circumscribed to particular chapters in the harmonized system, then basically almost anything goes. And the risk is that whatever committee is set up to review these may be flooded with requests from everybody and their brother who wants to make an argument that their particular product is somehow environmental. I don't think that's a reason not to have a living list, but just, I actually made this warning back in 2003 that, be careful what you ask for, and that if you don't have some kind of criteria for selection, you don't be surprised if you're bombarded with requests.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm looking out to see whether there's another question. Yes, this gentleman, please.
Tim from New Zealand. I just want to. I kind of agree with you, Ron, on your point about this difficulty. I think we're having quite a lot of challenges determining sustainably produced biofuels. Given the current HS classification, it's not very helpful, and it's putting us in a pretty difficult spot. So I hope one day, the WCO or maybe a different model can come and help us solve this issue. I just want to ask you about your electric vehicles presentation. I saw that graph which showed emissions can vary depending on the electricity that the vehicles are charged from. But if, I guess on a global scale, do you see electric vehicles having an overall positive impact in terms of emissions? Then perhaps if you just look at very narrowly the energy that it's produced from. So I just want to get a sense of the kind of global picture, a more of an aggregate kind of example. If you add that all up, from a policy point of view, is it environmentally credible from your perspective? And I've got another question for Geraldine, and it's around her point on the growth of green industrial policy since the GFC. And I think perhaps, a few governments around the world have been quite strategic about growing the green technology sector. And I think Jody raised the point that even in solar, there's a lot of small firms in this kind of space, and it's also the case with many other environmental technology sectors. There's quite a lot of niche and emerging technologies and firms. But looking into the future, do you see global players emerging? Do you see a consolidation of these smaller players into big international players, or do you see continued fragmentation of industry?
Would you like to go first, Geraldine, please?
So maybe I'll take it first because I apologize, I have to leave very soon, and one can take the question after. On the increasing use of green industrial policy, it's true that the level of concentration is critical to understand the dilemma. There's definitely been, in the aftermath of the overcapacity in the solar and wind energy market in 2011 and the reduction in policy support, there's been a consolidation process already happening in both solar PV and wind energy sectors. The concentration level is not the same across solar and wind. However, it's already quite highly concentrated. But I think what you already suggested in your question is the influence of certain large firms is not the same as all the multitude of small SMEs that are not necessarily at the same segments of the value chain, and typically downstream activities are very much supported by SMEs, and so SMEs are more to be found in the downstream segments than in the midstream. In terms of vertical integration, the process is very likely to continue, but I don't think it should. I think it makes a stronger case even for the careful consideration of the effectiveness of green industrial policies.
Okay, Ron, you want to pick it up?
I'm not sure I cut the question exactly, but I think it was basically, are you asking whether I think that the further expansion of or substitution of electric vehicles for internal combustion engine vehicles is a good, overall good for the environment, more or less? I mean, one never knows exactly, but I mean, the way I look at it is several things. One is that I think that we are hoping that we're starting to turn the corner, and that electricity supply in the future will be much cleaner, and therefore the life cycle emissions from electric vehicles will be better than just about everywhere eventually than from internal combustion engines. The other thing is that, and which I didn't mention before, is that the great thing about electric power is its scalability, and particularly the emissions. So yes, we have some very small motor scooters, for example, that then run off of petroleum, but they're usually pretty polluting and pretty noisy. So one thing that electric propulsion has already enabled are some pretty small city vehicles that are very, very energy efficient and don't take up a lot of parking space and so forth. I mean, there's also the whole concern about whether it's best to have electric vehicles, everybody having their own electric vehicle, or encouraging other electric propulsion like trams and electric buses and so forth. But I mean, again, the more that there's experience in this area, the more that the innovation will trickle over into these smaller and larger vehicles and so forth. So, yeah, personally, I think that there's, at this point anyway, I think there's, I look at it positively.
Okay, and we move on to Jody to answer.
Tim, regarding your question on if we see further fragmentation or consolidation in the industry, I'll answer it from 4 angles briefly. because it's a rather complex issue. Firstly, overcapacity. That peaked in 2010, but the average lifetime of manufacturing equipment is 5 years. After that, it's fully depreciated. So now that we're in 2015, a lot of the equipment that was installed 5 years ago is being phased out. It's no longer equipment that is producing products that customers want to buy. And so any production from that equipment is arguably non-competitive. In industry terms, it would be equipment producing 250 watt modules. The industry wants 270 today. Secondly, economies of scale. If you're manufacturing solar cells, you need to have a facility at about 500 megawatts a year, and for module assembly, at least 300. If you're not at that scale, you're uncompetitive and you can't take advantage of the economies of scale that would let you be globally competitive, regardless of where you're located. M&A, firms with good technologies are being acquired. If they're smaller and struggling, firms without good technologies will be closing. And lastly, bankability. To Geraldine's point about project development and investment being key moving forward, if your products in a project, whether it's a wind turbine or a solar module, are not from a top producer that investors believe will still be operating in 25 years to service any possible warranty claims, it's questionable if you can even get financing for that particular project. So if you're buying from a very small firm, a firm that's illustrative of this fragmentation that's characterized at least the solar industry in the past, it's questionable if you can really receive financing for that project. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jody. And thank you to all the audience for your attention today. We know that we have given you a lot of food for thought. There was a purpose on this, although we know you are struggling with the mandate you are set to deliver hopefully this year. I hope you also agree with us that ahead of us lies a lot of complex issues that also needs the handling, and we thought it would be clever to already here before we enter the second half of 2015 to put this small seed in, which can grow over the next month. So you prepare yourself for securing that you in fact will agree a living agreement. A living agreement means both an agreement that will take into consideration technology development in the area of industrial tariffs. So that's very relevant and things are moving fast in the industry. But a living agreement also means that you are addressing the rest of the mandate, the remainder of the mandate from the Davos Declaration, i.e. NTBs and services, and potentially even other important issues that we have discussed today. Therefore, it is not too early to leave this for your reflections on how to deal with this in the most constructive manner. Then I just want to say that all slides will be uploaded at our web pages, both City Alliance and ICTSD. You can take them down from there. Please fill out the feedback formula in front of you. And my last request to you is also go back to your industry partners back home in your capitals and countries and encourage them to engage in these negotiations. From the City Alliance perspective, we would be very happy to have new players coming in from all parts of the world, from all kind of green technologies, and I really mean it, all green technologies, all part of the world. So far, I think the attention is a bit concentrated on European players, but that is also natural because the European industry in this area has been the biggest so far. But certainly there are many players in your backyard which whom are relevant to engage, I think, going forward. So I will just leave that small appeal with you because we do think it is helpful that we have this exchange and dialogue between official negotiators and industry players who can explain what happens at the field level. So thank you very much for your participation and interest, and hope to see you soon again. Bye now.